Which, you should have never come, my daughter-in-law shouted before throwing my dinner plate onto the marble floor of the restaurant, while everyone stared at me in silence. The sound of ceramic shattering against the polished white tiles echoed through the dining room, so sharply that even the piano player near the bar stopped mid-song. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the waiters. Not the guests at nearby tables. Not even my son. I sat there frozen beneath the warm amber lights of Bellamy's Steakhouse in downtown Chicago, staring at the red pasta sauce slowly spreading near my shoes like spilled paint across polished stone. Vanessa stood across from me breathing heavily, one manicured hand still trembling beside her wine glass. Her blonde hair framed a face twisted with the kind of anger that doesn't appear overnight. No, that kind of hatred grows quietly for years. Vanessa, Ethan whispered under his breath, glancing nervously around the restaurant. But he didn't defend me. He didn't stand up for me. He didn't even ask if I was all right. That hurt more than her screaming ever could. I lowered my eyes toward the cloth napkin still folded neatly across my lap and carefully placed it beside my untouched water glass. My hands were steady. I remember noticing that. Strange, the things your mind focuses on when humiliation arrives publicly and all at once. Around us, silverware clinked softly as strangers pretended not to watch. A young waiter rushed forward holding extra napkins, but his eyes never fully met mine. He looked embarrassed for me. I smiled politely at him anyway. "It's all right," I said softly. My voice sounded distant, even to myself. Ethan rubbed his forehead the way he always did whenever life became inconvenient. "Mom," he muttered quietly, "maybe tonight just isn't the best night." Not the best night. I almost laughed. My son had invited me to this dinner himself 3 days earlier. He told me it was important. Said he and Vanessa had family matters to discuss. I should have recognized the tension in his voice then, but mothers have a dangerous habit of hearing hope where there is only warning. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror for nearly 20 minutes deciding which blouse to wear. I finally chose the cream-colored silk top my late husband Arthur used to love because he said it made my eyes look younger than they were. I even curled my silver hair slightly for the occasion. At 68 years old, I still believed showing up with dignity mattered, especially around family, especially after spending the last 2 years feeling myself slowly disappear from theirs. Bellamy's was crowded that evening. Friday nights usually were. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River, and through the tall windows the city lights reflected against the dark water like scattered gold. Couples laughed over cocktails. Businessmen loosened expensive ties. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered and waiters moved briskly between tables carrying trays of steak and wine. Everything looked normal, elegant, refined, which somehow made what happened feel even crueler. Vanessa had barely spoken to me since I arrived. She spent most of dinner scrolling through her phone or whispering things into Ethan's ear that stopped the moment I looked at them. At one point, I asked about my grandson Caleb's piano recital next week, and Vanessa responded without even lifting her eyes from her glass. "We're keeping it small. Keeping it small." That was the phrase she always used whenever she wanted to exclude me without sounding rude. Small Thanksgiving dinners. Small birthday gatherings. Small vacations. Small holidays. Somehow there was never enough room for Ethan's mother anymore. Halfway through dinner, a man in a gray suit approached our table holding a leather folder. He smiled professionally at Ethan first, then slid the folder beside Vanessa. "Everything is prepared," he said quietly. My stomach tightened instantly. Vanessa reached toward the folder, then stopped when she noticed me staring. "What's that?" I asked. Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, we were going to explain everything tonight." There it was again. That tone people use right before they change your life forever. Vanessa finally looked directly at me then. Her expression wasn't nervous. It wasn't guilty either. It was irritated. Like my presence itself had become exhausting to her. "Honestly, Helen," she sighed, leaning back in her chair, "this would all be so much easier if you just cooperated for once." I frowned slightly. Cooperated with what? Ethan opened his mouth, but Vanessa cut him off immediately. "The house," she snapped. "The trust. All of it." A cold heaviness settled into my chest. "What about the house?" I asked carefully. Vanessa laughed once under her breath, though there was nothing amused in her eyes. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said. "We're trying to move forward with our lives while you cling to the past like some ghost haunting everybody." Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa! No, she interrupted sharply. I'm tired of pretending. Then she looked directly at me in the middle of that beautiful restaurant while strangers quietly listened from nearby tables, and her voice turned sharp enough to cut glass. Which, she hissed, you should have never come. And before I could say a single word, her hand struck the edge of my dinner plate, sending it crashing onto the floor between us. But what my daughter-in-law didn't know that night was this. 2 weeks earlier, I had already discovered what they'd been hiding from me. And by the time that plate shattered at my feet, I was no longer the helpless old woman they believed I was. I left the restaurant without finishing dinner. The night air along the Chicago River felt colder than it should have for early October, and for a few seconds I simply stood outside Bellamy's staring at the reflections trembling across the dark water below the bridge. Behind me, laughter and music continued inside the restaurant as if nothing had happened. That was the strange thing about humiliation. The world never stopped for it. Cars still passed. Glasses still clinked. Strangers still went on with their evenings while your entire understanding of your family quietly collapsed inside your chest. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and walked slowly toward the parking garage 3 blocks away. My heels clicked softly against the sidewalk. I remember hearing another woman nearby laughing into her phone while a taxi splashed through rainwater beside the curb. Everything around me looked ordinary, but my hands felt numb. Ethan did not follow me outside. That stayed with me the entire drive home. Not because I expected him to choose me over his wife anymore. I had stopped expecting that years ago. But some foolish part of motherhood still believed a son would come after his mother after watching her publicly humiliated. Instead, 20 minutes after I got home, my phone lit up with a text message from him. Mom, maybe give everyone some space tonight. Space. I stared at that word for a long time while standing alone in my kitchen beneath the dim yellow light over the stove. My house suddenly felt too quiet, too large. Arthur used to fill silence without even trying. The sound of his newspaper turning in the mornings. The soft hum of jazz records on Sunday afternoons. The way he would clear his throat before speaking whenever something bothered him. After 42 years of marriage, silence had never frightened me until after he died. I set my purse carefully onto the kitchen counter and noticed my reflection in the dark window above the sink. Silver hair slightly out of place. Lipstick faded. Eyes more tired than they had been 2 hours earlier. I looked older tonight. Not physically. Spiritually. I opened the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of water, though my throat felt too tight to drink it. On the counter beside the fruit bowl sat the envelope that had arrived 2 weeks earlier. Plain white. No return address. I had nearly thrown it away unopened. Inside had been copies of loan documents tied to my home, along with statements from accounts I had never authorized. At first I thought it had to be some kind of banking mistake. But then I recognized Ethan's signature. And beneath his signature was Vanessa's. I carried the envelope into the living room and sat down in Arthur's old leather chair beside the fireplace. The papers trembled slightly in my hands now, though they had not when I first discovered them. Back then, confusion protected me from reality. Tonight, reality had finally arrived. There it was in black ink across multiple pages. Home equity. Applications. Trust withdrawals. Financial transfers connected to the family estate Arthur spent decades building. My son had used my property as collateral without ever sitting down to explain it to me. Vanessa had witnessed every signature. Suddenly, the dinner invitation made sense. The leather folder at the restaurant. The rehearsed tension in Ethan's voice. They had expected me to sign something tonight. Probably more paperwork. More control. More surrender disguised as concern. And when I did not cooperate quickly enough, Vanessa lost control of her mask. I leaned back slowly in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Somewhere upstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed 10 times through the empty house. Arthur always maintained that clock himself. Every Sunday, evening like ritual. I could almost picture him standing there adjusting the tiny brass pendulum with patient hands. Never let people rush you into decisions. He used to tell me whenever contracts or money were involved. Especially family. Desperation makes strangers dangerous. Greed makes relatives worse. At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Tonight, sitting alone with those documents spread across my lap, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The next morning, I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. For years after Arthur passed away, grief had trained my body to wake early. as if some part of me still expected to hear him downstairs making coffee in the kitchen. The house remained silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain tapping lightly against the windows. I stayed in bed for several minutes, staring at the pale gray ceiling above me, replaying the previous evening in fragments. Vanessa's voice. The crash of the plate. Ethan lowering his eyes instead of looking at me. Strange how humiliation repeats itself more clearly in the quiet of morning. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting alone at the kitchen table with untouched toast growing cold beside my coffee. Outside, the maple trees lining my street bent gently beneath the October wind, their red leaves scattering across wet sidewalks. I used to love autumn in Chicago. Arthur and I would drive north every October to look at the changing leaves near Lake Geneva, stopping at little diners along the highway for pie and coffee. Back then, family still felt permanent. Safe. I glanced toward my phone when it buzzed softly beside my mug. For one foolish second, I hoped Ethan had finally come to his senses. Instead, the message was from Vanessa. We should all calm down and discuss things like adults. I read it twice. Not an apology. Not even acknowledgement of what she had done. Just control wrapped in polite language. That was Vanessa's talent. She could turn cruelty into professionalism so smoothly that people questioned whether they had been hurt at all. I set the phone face down and looked around the kitchen slowly. The room still carried traces of Arthur everywhere. His favorite navy coffee mug hanging beside the cabinet. The reading glasses he once insisted he would repair himself still sitting in the junk drawer. The old radio near the window permanently tuned to jazz because neither of us ever bothered changing it. This house was not simply property. It was 42 years of ordinary moments stitched together quietly over time. Birthday dinners. Christmas mornings. Late-night conversations after Ethan went to sleep upstairs. We built this life inch by inch together. And now my own son was treating it like paperwork to transfer. Around noon, I drove to the bank downtown carrying the envelope inside my leather tote bag. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the streets shining beneath weak sunlight. I noticed my hands tightening around the steering wheel the closer I got to the financial district. Part of me still wanted someone to explain that there had been some misunderstanding, that Ethan had not knowingly betrayed me. Mothers become experts at inventing excuses for their children. The bank lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. Men in dark suits moved quickly between offices while quiet music drifted from hidden speakers overhead. A young receptionist smiled politely when I approached the front desk. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How may I help you today? I need to review some loan documents connected to my property," I said carefully. My own voice sounded calm, almost detached. She nodded professionally and asked me to wait. 10 minutes later, a branch manager named Daniel Harper invited me into his office overlooking LaSalle Street. He appeared to be in his early 50s with silver at his temples and the tired expression of a man who spent his life delivering difficult information politely. I handed him the documents without speaking much. He adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the pages one at a time. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Finally, he looked up slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "were you present when these applications were signed?" A cold heaviness settled beneath my ribs. "No," I answered quietly. Daniel hesitated before turning one of the pages toward me. "Then I think there are several things you need to understand immediately." In that moment, sitting inside that quiet office high above downtown Chicago, I realized the dinner at Bellamy's had never truly been about family reconciliation. It had been about panic. Someone was running out of time. And whatever Ethan and Vanessa had done was far worse than I originally imagined. Daniel closed the office door before returning to his desk with the folder in his hands. The movement was small, almost routine, but something about it made my stomach tighten. People only close doors when conversations are about to become dangerous. Outside his office window, downtown Chicago moved as usual beneath the gray afternoon sky. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic. Pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. Somewhere far below, a siren echoed faintly between buildings. Life continued with indifferent precision while mine quietly shifted beneath my feet. Daniel sat down carefully and folded his hands together before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "according to these records, there have been multiple financial transactions connected to your property over the past 14 months. 14 months. I stared at him without speaking. 14 months ago was shortly after Arthur's funeral. Back when casseroles still arrived from neighbors and sympathy cards covered my dining room table. Back when I could barely remember to eat lunch, let alone review bank statements. I do not understand, I said finally. Daniel slid several pages toward me across the polished desk. Your home was used to secure a business line of credit connected to Whitmore Consulting Group. I looked down at the paperwork. Ethan's company. My son had inherited part of Arthur's consulting business after college, though Arthur always kept majority control himself. He believed Ethan was talented but impulsive. Success without discipline becomes entitlement. Arthur once told me quietly after Ethan bought a $70,000 sports car at 26. At the time, I accused Arthur of being too hard on him. Now I wondered if he had simply seen things more clearly than I did. These signatures are not mine, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. I was afraid you might say that. A cold silence settled between us. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere inside the office. My eyes drifted again to the signatures on the page. My name written in careful cursive that almost looked believable until you studied it closely. Close enough to fool strangers. Not close enough to fool me. How much? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. The current exposure tied to the property is approximately $1.8 million. The number landed softly but heavily inside my chest. $1.8 million. I thought about the house instantly. The white colonial Arthur and I bought 37 years ago when Ethan was still in middle school. The treehouse Arthur built in the backyard one summer after watching Ethan spend weeks sketching designs on notebook paper. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Family photographs lining the staircase. Every ordinary memory suddenly felt fragile, like paper left too close to flame. There is more, Daniel said carefully. Of course there was. There is always more. He opened another section of the file and turned several pages toward me. 3 months ago, additional requests were submitted involving the family trust. My throat tightened. Arthur's trust had been structured carefully years earlier through our attorney. Portions were designated for Ethan eventually, but Arthur intentionally protected the primary assets while I was alive. Were the requests approved? I asked. Daniel gave a slow nod. Some of them, yes. I looked down at the dates listed beside each transfer and realized something that made my chest ache in a completely different way. Ethan had visited me the morning after several of these withdrawals. Sat in my kitchen drinking coffee while asking about my blood pressure medication. Hugged me goodbye before leaving with leftovers packed neatly into containers. All while knowing exactly what he was doing behind my back. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had fingerprints now. Timing. Planning. Intention. Daniel removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose wearily. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something difficult. I lifted my eyes toward him slowly. Do you believe your son understands the legal consequences of what has happened here? For several seconds, I could not answer. Because the terrible truth settling inside me was this. Ethan probably did understand. But Vanessa understood even better. Suddenly her anger at the restaurant made perfect sense. They were not frustrated with me for refusing to cooperate. They were terrified because I had started asking questions. I drove home from the bank in complete silence. No radio. No music. Just the sound of tires rolling over wet pavement while downtown Chicago disappeared slowly behind me in the rearview mirror. The city looked washed clean after the rain, but inside my chest everything felt heavier than before. Betrayal changes shape once numbers become involved. Cruel words can sometimes be explained away as anger or stress. But paperwork tells the truth with cold precision. Signatures, dates, transfers, intentions. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sky had already begun turning dark blue with approaching evening. My house stood exactly as it always had. White shutters, front porch swing. The maple tree Arthur planted the year Ethan graduated high school still towering over the yard. From the outside, nothing looked broken. That almost made it worse. I sat in the car for several minutes, with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the warm porch light glowing near the front door. Arthur always insisted on leaving that light on for me whenever I drove somewhere alone at night. A home should look like it is waiting for you, he used to say. I wondered what he would think now if he knew our son had turned that same home into collateral. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candle I lit the night before. The familiar scent nearly unraveled me more than the bank meeting had. Grief works that way. Sometimes paperwork will not break you, but a candle will. I carried the folder into Arthur's old study and closed the door behind me. The room remained almost untouched since his death 2 years earlier. Dark walnut bookshelves lined the walls. His framed Northwestern University diploma still hung beside the fireplace. Even his reading chair remained angled toward the window exactly the way he left it. For months after losing him, I could not bring myself to change anything in here. Now I finally understood why. Some part of me knew this room still protected pieces of him I would eventually need. I sat at his desk and carefully opened the bottom drawer where Arthur kept important legal documents. Tax records, insurance policies, trust agreements. Everything organized with the same disciplined precision he applied to every part of life. Near the back of the drawer sat a navy blue folder labeled simply, Helen. My breath caught slightly when I saw his handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside were copies of the original trust documents along with several handwritten notes Arthur had added over the years. One page immediately drew my attention. It was dated only 6 months before his death. Arthur's handwriting looked shakier than usual, but still deliberate. If Ethan ever allows outside influence to compromise family integrity, all primary control remains with Helen. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Outside influence. Arthur had never fully trusted Vanessa. He remained polite toward her, but I remembered the subtle distance he always kept. The way his smile tightened whenever she pushed conversations toward money or inheritance. Back then I thought he was simply protective. Now I wondered how much he truly saw. My phone buzzed suddenly against the desk, pulling me from my thoughts. Ethan. I watched his name flash across the screen while something cold settled quietly into place inside me. Not rage. Not even sadness anymore. Clarity. I let the call ring 3 times before answering. Mom. Ethan said quickly, his voice strained. Vanessa feels terrible about last night. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course, she did not feel terrible about humiliating me. She felt terrified about the bank. Does she? I asked calmly. Silence stretched for half a second too long. Then Ethan cleared his throat. We just think everybody should sit down together and talk before things get out of hand. Before things get out of hand. The wording told me everything. He already knew I had started uncovering the truth. I looked down at Arthur's handwritten note, still resting open on the desk in front of me. Family integrity. Outside influence. Primary control remains with Helen. For the first time in months, I no longer felt like the lonely widow they expected me to be. I felt like Arthur had prepared for this long before I ever imagined he would need to. The following morning, I began moving through my house differently. Not emotionally. Strategically. It surprised me how quickly grief could transform into focus once the truth finally had shape. For 2 years after Arthur's death, I had wandered through my own life, like someone waiting for permission to exist again. Suddenly, that feeling disappeared. I made coffee just after sunrise and sat at the kitchen island with a legal pad beside me, writing down every account, every property document, every name connected to the trust. Outside, the neighborhood remained peaceful. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Fallen leaves drifted across damp sidewalks. Ordinary life continued quietly, while my family's carefully hidden panic grew larger by the hour. Ethan called twice before 9 o'clock. I let both calls go to voicemail. His messages sounded increasingly nervous each time. Mom, we really need to clear up some misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. That word almost impressed me. He still wanted this to sound accidental. Human beings will commit terrible betrayals as long as they can rename them into something softer afterward. Around 10 o'clock, I drove to Arthur's longtime attorney, Leonard Grayson, whose office overlooked Grant Park. Leonard had handled our family legal affairs for nearly 30 years. He attended Ethan's college graduation, sent flowers when Arthur passed away. He was one of the few people left in my life who still spoke about my husband in present tense sometimes, as though part of him remained nearby. Leonard greeted me personally in the lobby the moment I arrived. His expression changed immediately when he saw my face. Helen, he said quietly, what happened? I almost answered honestly. Everything happened. But instead, I simply handed him the folder. We sat together in his office for nearly 2 hours reviewing every document connected to the trust and the property loans. The deeper Leonard looked, the quieter he became. At one point, he removed his glasses entirely and leaned back heavily in his chair. Arthur suspected something like this might eventually happen, he admitted carefully. I looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Leonard folded his hands together. Your husband loved Ethan deeply, but he worried Ethan lacked boundaries where money and influence were concerned. Influence. Again that word. Always circling back to Vanessa without needing to say her name directly. Leonard opened a locked cabinet behind his desk and removed another file I had never seen before. Inside were amended trust provisions Arthur completed shortly before his cancer treatments began. Arthur instructed me not to activate these documents unless circumstances required it, Leonard explained softly. My chest tightened. Activate what exactly? Leonard slid the papers across the desk toward me. Emergency control clauses. I stared down at the pages while my pulse slowly quickened. Arthur had quietly protected nearly every major family asset under my sole authority if financial misconduct or coercion ever threatened the estate. The house, the investment accounts, the company shares, everything. Ethan could access portions only under strict conditions. Conditions he had already violated. He knew, I whispered. Leonard nodded slowly. I do not think Arthur expected Ethan to intentionally hurt you. But I do think he worried someone might convince him that protecting himself mattered more than protecting family. Someone. Again, nobody needed to say Vanessa's name aloud anymore. Her presence sat inside every sentence regardless. Leonard looked directly at me, then with an expression I had not seen from another adult in a very long time. Respect. Not pity. Not sympathy. Respect. Helen, he said firmly, you are not powerless here. The words settled into me slowly. Powerless. That was exactly how Vanessa wanted me to feel at Bellamy's. Small. Embarrassed. Old. Disposable. But sitting there inside Leonard's office with Arthur's safeguards spread across the desk between us, I suddenly understood something important. The dinner was never meant to humiliate me emotionally. It was meant to pressure me financially. And when pressure failed, Vanessa lost control. Leonard began outlining the immediate legal steps we needed to take while I listened quietly, absorbing every detail. Temporary account freezes. Internal investigations. Asset protections. For the first time since Arthur died, I no longer felt like a widow trying to survive inside someone else's decisions. I felt like the woman Arthur trusted to finish what he started. 3 days later, everything began unraveling for them exactly the way Leonard predicted it would. Quietly at first, then all at once. I was watering the flowers near my kitchen window that Thursday morning when my phone started vibrating repeatedly against the counter. Ethan called twice within 10 minutes. Then Vanessa. Then Ethan again. I looked down at their names flashing across the screen while sunlight spilled softly across the hardwood floors beside me. For the first time in years, their panic no longer controlled my emotions. It simply confirmed what I already knew. Leonard had moved quickly after our meeting. Temporary restrictions had been placed on several trust-related accounts pending formal investigation. Certain company assets connected to the estate were frozen until document verification could be completed. Nothing dramatic on the surface. No police cars. No courtroom scenes. Just signatures changing behind office doors. Passwords revoked quietly. Access disappearing one account at a time. Real consequences rarely arrive loudly at first. Around noon, Ethan finally left a voicemail instead of another missed call. His voice sounded strained and exhausted. Mom, please call me back. There are issues with the company accounts. Something is wrong with payroll processing and the bank is refusing to release funds. I listened to the message twice while standing in Arthur's study. Then I deleted it. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. For years, I mistook rescuing Ethan for loving him. Arthur used to warn me about that gently. Every time you soften consequences, he once told me, you teach people that your boundaries are negotiable. I never fully understood those words until now. By late afternoon, another call arrived. This time from Vanessa. I almost ignored it, but curiosity made me answer. Helen, she said immediately, her voice unnaturally sweet. There seems to be some confusion with the bank. Confusion again. Always confusion. Never accountability. I remained silent. Vanessa continued quickly. Ethan is under tremendous pressure right now, and freezing those accounts could seriously damage the business. Damage the business. Not damage the family. Not damage trust. Not damage me. The business. Money reveals priorities faster than grief ever does. You forged my signature, I said calmly. The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds, but it felt much longer. Helen, Vanessa replied carefully. That is a very harsh way to describe what happened. I almost admired the audacity of it. Then describe it another way, I answered quietly. Another silence. This one sharper. We were trying to protect investments during a difficult transition period after Arthur passed, she finally said. There it was. The justification. People rarely see themselves as villains. They simply rename betrayal into practicality. You used my home without permission, I said. You manipulated trust accounts. And you publicly humiliated me when I stopped cooperating. Vanessa exhaled heavily through the phone. Her patience was beginning to crack again beneath the polished tone. You are overreacting, she snapped softly. Everything Ethan has done was for this family. I looked around Arthur's study while she spoke. The framed photographs. The shelves of old law books. The quiet dignity my husband built into every corner of this house over 4 decades. No, I replied calmly. Everything Ethan has done was for himself. Vanessa's breathing sharpened slightly. If the company collapses because of this investigation, Ethan could lose everything. That sentence finally exposed the truth underneath all the manipulation. Fear, not remorse. Fear. I lowered myself slowly into Arthur's chair beside the fireplace. Then perhaps, I said quietly, he should have thought about that before signing my name. Vanessa's voice changed completely then. The softness disappeared. You are destroying your own son. I stared at the rain beginning to fall outside the study windows. Small drops sliding slowly down the glass. No, I answered. I am simply refusing to let him destroy me first. After I ended the call, the house became silent again except for the ticking grandfather clock downstairs. But something had changed inside that silence now. For the first time since Bellamy's, I realized Vanessa no longer believed she was in control. And dangerous people become even more reckless once they realize power is slipping away from them. The invitation arrived on heavy cream-colored cardstock 2 days later. Annual Whitmore Consulting Charity Gala. Black tie required. Grand Regency Ballroom. Saturday at 7 o'clock. I almost laughed when I saw Ethan's signature printed neatly at the bottom beside Vanessa's. Even now, with investigations tightening around them and financial accounts under review, they still intended to perform the image of a perfect family in public. Some people would rather drown elegantly than survive honestly. I placed the invitation carefully on the kitchen counter beside Arthur's old watch and stared at it while evening sunlight stretched across the room. For years, the gala had been Arthur's event. He believed successful businesses had a responsibility to support the community around them. Scholarships, veteran housing programs, food drives during winter, real charity. Not public relations disguised as kindness. After Arthur died, Ethan and Vanessa turned the gala into something shinier. More photographers, more luxury sponsors, less sincerity. I had stopped attending after the first year because Vanessa made it increasingly obvious I no longer fit the image she wanted beside her. Older women make ambitious people uncomfortable once they stop being useful. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. Chicago glittered beneath the autumn night like scattered diamonds as I stood in my bedroom, fastening pearl earrings Arthur bought for our 40th anniversary. I chose a long black velvet dress with simple sleeves and no dramatic jewelry beyond my wedding ring. Elegance does not need to announce itself loudly. Before leaving, I paused briefly in front of the hallway mirror. For the first time in a long while, I recognized the woman looking back at me, not because she looked younger, but because she no longer looked afraid. The Grand Regency Ballroom overflowed with soft golden light and expensive perfume when I arrived shortly after 7:30. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, while waiters circulated carrying champagne trays between wealthy donors and business executives. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Conversations floated through the ballroom in polished fragments about investments, politics, and charity pledges. Near the entrance, several guests visibly froze when they saw me walk in. Word travels quickly in wealthy circles, especially scandal. I noticed the shift immediately. The careful glances, the whispers hidden behind champagne glasses. Some people looked sympathetic, others looked curious, but the most satisfying expression of all belonged to Vanessa. She stood near the center of the ballroom wearing an ivory gown with silver embroidery, smiling beside Ethan for a photographer when her eyes suddenly landed on me across the room. Her smile disappeared instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for me to see the fear underneath it. Ethan turned moments later and nearly dropped the drink in his hand. I continued walking calmly toward them across the ballroom floor, while conversations around us softened into cautious silence. "Mom," Ethan said quickly once I reached them. "I did not know you were coming tonight." "That is strange," I replied softly, "considering my name is still on half the foundation documents in this room." Vanessa recovered first, of course. She always did. "Helen," she said with practiced politeness, leaning forward slightly for an air kiss I did not return. "You look lovely." Her eyes, however, looked exhausted. Dark circles hidden beneath expensive makeup. Panic leaves fingerprints no cosmetic can fully erase. "Thank you," I answered calmly. "You look nervous." Ethan immediately glanced between us. "Mom, maybe this is not the right place for honesty?" I interrupted quietly. Nearby conversations had nearly stopped entirely now. Several board members pretended to study auction items while very obviously listening. Vanessa's posture stiffened. "If you are here to embarrass us," she began sharply. I almost smiled. Embarrass. Such an interesting word coming from the woman who shattered a dinner plate at my feet in a crowded restaurant. Before I could respond, Leonard Grayson entered the ballroom carrying a slim black briefcase beneath one arm. The moment Ethan saw him, all color drained from his face. That was when I understood something important. My son had known exactly how serious this situation truly was all along. And suddenly, standing beneath those glittering chandeliers while wealthy strangers watched our family fracture in real time, I realized the performance Ethan and Vanessa built their entire lives around was finally beginning to collapse. Leonard did not raise his voice when he approached us in the ballroom. He did not need to. Authority rarely announces itself loudly. The moment people recognized him, conversations throughout the Grand Regency softened into uneasy silence. He greeted several board members politely before stopping beside me with calm professionalism. "Good evening, Helen," he said warmly. Then he turned toward Ethan and Vanessa. "We need to speak privately regarding the trust investigation." Vanessa forced a tight smile almost instantly. "Tonight is really not appropriate for legal discussions," she replied carefully, though tension sharpened every word. Leonard remained perfectly calm. Unfortunately, certain financial institutions disagreed. Ethan looked pale beneath the ballroom lights now. He loosened his collar slightly and glanced around the room, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. Nearby donors pretended not to stare, but curiosity filled the air thicker than perfume. Wealthy circles survive on polished gossip. Public disgrace travels faster than truth ever does. Leonard opened his briefcase slowly and removed several documents. "As of this afternoon," he continued evenly, "all unauthorized trust activity connected to the Whitmore estate has been formally suspended pending legal review." Vanessa's expression finally cracked. Just slightly, but enough. "Unauthorized," she repeated sharply. "That wording is completely unfair." Leonard did not react emotionally. Forgery investigations tend to involve uncomfortable wording. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That small gesture hurt me more than anything else that evening because it revealed exhaustion rather than innocence. Somewhere along the way, my son had stopped fighting against Vanessa's influence and simply started drifting beside it. One compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, until eventually he could no longer separate ambition from betrayal. "Mom," Ethan said quietly, turning toward me at last, "please do not do this here." I looked at him carefully beneath the chandelier light. The little boy who used to fall asleep on Arthur's shoulder after Little League games felt impossibly far away now. "Do what?" I asked softly. "Protect myself?" Vanessa stepped forward before Ethan could answer. "Everything we did was for the company," she insisted quickly. "You know how unstable things became after Arthur died. We were trying to preserve the business." Preserve. Another beautiful word wrapped around ugly behavior. I glanced around the ballroom filled with crystal glasses and expensive tuxedos. "Arthur spent 40 years building this company with integrity," I said calmly. Not desperation. Nobody interrupted me now. Even the jazz quartet had quietly stopped playing. "You used my home without permission," I continued. "You manipulated trust accounts intended to protect this family. And when I questioned you, you humiliated me publicly because you thought embarrassment would pressure me into silence." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but Leonard handed Ethan another document before she could speak. Ethan looked down at the page and visibly froze. "What is that?" Vanessa demanded. Ethan did not answer immediately. His hands trembled slightly holding the paper. Finally, Leonard spoke for him. "Emergency control transfer authorization," he explained. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Whitmore resumes sole oversight of all protected estate assets pending final review." Vanessa's face lost all remaining color. "You cannot be serious." Leonard's expression never changed. Arthur Whitmore was extremely serious when he drafted these provisions. Hearing Arthur's name spoken aloud inside that ballroom changed something inside me. Not grief this time. Strength. My husband had seen the danger long before I did. And even while dying, he made certain I would not face it defenseless. Ethan finally looked up at me then, with eyes full of something I had not seen from him in years. "Shame. Real shame. Mom," he whispered hoarsely. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I believed him, strangely enough. Not because he was innocent, but because weakness rarely plans where it will eventually end. It simply keeps surrendering one decision at a time. I stepped closer and adjusted the sleeve of his tuxedo, gently the same way I used to when he was young. "The night she shattered that plate in front of everyone," I said quietly, "you stood there and let her treat me like I was disposable." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. That was the moment I understood I was no longer losing my family. I continued softly.